Welcome to one of the most unsettling cases recorded in the history of Mobile, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The plantation stood 17 miles north of Mobile, Alabama, at the edge of a cypress swamp. Built in 1798 by the first Beauregard to settle in the territory, it had weathered hurricanes, economic shifts, and the changing of flags from Spanish to American. By 1841, it was one of the oldest estates in the county, its columned facade weathered by time and salt air from the nearby Gulf. The auction had drawn a modest crowd that February morning. Most were there for field hands or domestic servants, gathered at the wooden platform erected in the town square. 13 individuals stood in a line, eyes downcast, clothing threadbare despite the chill. The 12th among them caught no one's attention. She was kept apart, slightly removed from the group, a woman of perhaps 30 years, though it was difficult to tell. Her left side bore extensive scarring from what appeared to be severe burns, distorting her features and pulling her mouth into a permanent grimace. Her left eye was clouded white, and her arm hung stiffly at an unnatural angle. When the auctioneer reached her, his practiced enthusiasm faltered. He began listing practical matters. She could work despite her limitations, was obedient, healthy apart from her disfigurement. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer lowered the starting price. Still nothing. He was preparing to move on when a voice spoke from the back of the gathering. Thomas Beauregard had not intended to purchase anyone that day. At 43, he had come to town for banking matters related to his plantation's mortgage. His father had died the previous summer, leaving him the property, its 83 slaves, and considerable debt. The new master of Beauregard Hall had been avoiding the responsibilities of his inheritance for months, until the bank's letters became impossible to ignore. When he offered a sum so low it made the auctioneer blink in surprise, no one contested it. Within an hour, papers were signed, and the woman was seated in the back of Beauregard's carriage, a small cloth bundle containing her only possessions clutched in her good hand. Neither spoke during the journey from Mobile to the plantation. The only sound was the rhythmic creaking of the carriage and the occasional cough from the driver perched above. Thomas Beauregard did not look back at his purchase. Beauregard Hall came into view as the carriage rounded a bend in the oak-lined drive. The house rose 3 stories, its white paint graying and peeling in places. 8 columns supported a balcony that wrapped around the front and eastern side. Chimneys rose from both wings, thin wisps of smoke indicating fires kept burning despite the mild weather. The surrounding gardens, once meticulously maintained, had grown somewhat wild in recent months. As the carriage stopped before the main entrance, a tall man descended the front steps. Isaiah had been the Beauregard family's house manager for 25 years. He helped Thomas down from the carriage before turning his attention to the woman still seated inside. For a moment he hesitated, his practiced formality slipping as he took in her appearance. He recovered quickly, extending his hand to assist her. The woman did not take it, instead climbing down slowly on her own, her movements deliberate and careful. Isaiah showed her to the kitchen entrance at the rear of the house, his voice low as he explained what would be expected of her. Thomas Beauregard entered through the front door and did not inquire about her for the remainder of the day. The woman was given a small room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. It contained a straw mattress on a low wooden frame, a 3-legged stool, and a peg on the wall for hanging clothes. The head cook, Martha, showed her where to wash and explained the household routine. When she asked the woman her name, there was a long pause before she answered, her voice rasping slightly, Adeline. The name was recorded in the household ledger by Isaiah later that evening. Beauregard Hall operated with the mechanical precision of most large plantations. Meals were served at exact times, cleaning was performed according to strict schedules, and each person knew their place in the hierarchy. Adeline was assigned to help in the laundry, where her disfigurement would remain largely out of sight. The work was difficult, hauling water, stirring boiling pots, scrubbing linens against washboards, but Adeline performed her duties without complaint or comment. She spoke only when directly addressed, her answers brief and practical. The other house servants watched her with a mixture of pity and wariness. Her scarred appearance made some uncomfortable, but it was her silence that truly unsettled them. Even in the slave quarters, where people found moments of community amid their hardship, Adeline kept to herself. 3 weeks passed before Thomas Beauregard took any notice of her. He had spent most of that time secluded in his father's study, poring over account books and correspondence. The plantation was in worse financial condition than he had initially believed. The elder Beauregard had made several poor investments in the years before his death, and there were outstanding debts to merchants in Mobile and New Orleans. One evening, working late into the night, Thomas called for coffee. The usual house servant had retired for the evening, and it was Adeline who answered the bell, carrying a silver tray with a pot of coffee and a single cup. She had kept her head bowed as she entered, but as she set the tray on the desk, she looked up briefly. Thomas Beauregard froze, cup halfway to his lips. Something in her gaze, her right eye, the one not clouded by injury, struck him as familiar. A memory tugged at the edges of his mind, but when he tried to focus on it, it slipped away. He dismissed her with a wave and returned to his ledgers, but found himself unable to concentrate for the remainder of the evening. The next morning, Thomas requested that Isaiah reassign Adeline to household duties. When asked why, he muttered something about needing additional help with the cleaning of the study and library. Isaiah, though surprised, made the arrangements. Adeline began working in the main house the following day. She dusted shelves of leather-bound books that had not been touched in years, polished silver that had tarnished from neglect, and swept fireplaces thick with the ash of winters past. Thomas rarely acknowledged her presence, but she was always aware of his. He would pause in doorways, watching her work, before continuing on his way without a word. Occasionally, he would enter a room where she was cleaning and make a pretense of looking for something, only to leave without taking anything. The other house servants noticed this unusual attention, but knew better than to comment. As March turned to April, the plantation slowly came back to life after the dormant winter months. In the fields, the first shoots of cotton pushed through the dark soil. The days grew longer, the sunlight stronger. A subtle shift occurred within the house as well. Thomas began taking his meals in the dining room rather than the study, and he instructed that fresh flowers be brought in from the gardens. On a Sunday afternoon, he emerged from his room wearing a newly pressed suit, his beard trimmed, and announced he would be attending church in town, something he had not done since his father's funeral, April 20th, 1841. The date would later be recorded in Isaiah's meticulous household journal, though the significance of the entry would only become clear much later. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably warm. Thomas Beauregard had been meeting with his overseer about repairs needed for the cotton gin before the harvest season. Their conversation had run long, and Thomas was late for the midday meal. He entered through the side door, passing the library, when he heard it, a soft, melodic humming. He paused, listening. The tune was simple, repetitive, a lullaby. He found himself moving toward the sound before he had made a conscious decision to do so. Adeline was in the library, reaching up with her good arm to dust a high shelf. She did not hear him enter, continuing her quiet song. Thomas stood in the doorway, a strange expression on his face. When she finally turned and saw him, the humming stopped abruptly. She lowered her gaze and made to leave the room, but he raised a hand, stopping her. The question came out haltingly, as if he were speaking a language he had not used in years. "Where did you learn that song?" Adeline did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "In the nursery, little Tommy." The blood drained from Thomas Beauregard's face. No one had called him by that name since he was a child. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 13 times that night, though it was only midnight. The sound echoed through the silent house, waking several of the servants from their sleep. Isaiah rose to check the mechanism, assuming it had malfunctioned, but found the clock working perfectly when he examined it. It was the first of several strange occurrences that spring. Doors that had been securely latched were found open in the morning. Objects disappeared from rooms, only to reappear days later in entirely different parts of the house. The smell of roses would suddenly fill a room, though none were present. Most disturbing were the footprints that appeared one morning after a light rain, small like those of a child, leading from the garden up to the main house, ending abruptly at the back steps. The servants whispered among themselves, some suggesting that the old house was haunted, others that these events were signs of impending misfortune. None connected them to Adeline's arrival or to the change in Thomas Beauregard's behavior. He had taken to spending long hours in the library, requesting that his meals be brought to him there. He seldom left the plantation anymore, cancelling business appointments in Mobile and declining invitations from neighboring families. Most notably, he'd begun calling for Adeline specifically, asking her to bring his food or tend the library fire, tasks typically assigned to other, more senior house servants. On the 1st of May, a letter arrived from Charleston. It bore the seal of the Harper family, once prominent merchants whose shipping business had connected Charleston to ports throughout the Caribbean. The courier who delivered it had ridden hard from Mobile, arriving at Beauregard Hall as the sun was setting. Thomas received the letter in his study, dismissing the household staff for the evening immediately afterward. No one witnessed his reaction to its contents, but the sound of breaking glass echoed from behind the closed door later that night. The next morning, he summoned Isaiah before dawn and instructed him to prepare the carriage for a journey to Mobile. He would be taking Adeline with him. Isaiah, surprised but too well trained to question his employer, made the arrangements as requested. They departed as the first light of day was breaking over the cypress swamp. In town, Thomas left Adeline waiting in the carriage while he visited the offices of Harwick & Sons, attorneys at law. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. When he emerged, his expression was grim but determined. The next stop was the courthouse, where the county records were kept. Here, too, Adeline remained in the carriage while Thomas conducted his business inside. By the time they returned to the plantation, darkness had fallen, and an unusual silence hung over the estate. Even the night insects seemed to have gone quiet. For 3 days following the trip to Mobile, Thomas Beauregard locked himself in his study, emerging only briefly for meals. He spoke to no one about the purpose of his visit to town or the contents of the letter from Charleston. On the evening of the 3rd day, he called for Adeline to bring him tea. When she entered the study, he instructed her to close the door and take a seat across from him, an unprecedented request that violated the strict social boundaries of the household. For several minutes, he studied her face in silence, his gaze lingering on her scars. Then he asked her a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Do you remember Rosewood Plantation?" The name hung in the air between them. Adeline's expression remained unchanged, but her hand, the uninjured one, tightened slightly around the fabric of her dress. "Yes, Master Thomas," she finally answered, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. He leaned forward, his next words careful, measured. "And do you remember what happened there in the summer of 1823? She did not reply immediately. When she did, her words were so quiet that Thomas had to strain to hear them. "I remember everything about Rosewood, every day, every night." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, though no one but the 2 participants ever knew its full content. Isaiah, passing by the study in the early hours of the morning, heard Thomas's voice, alternately rising in what sounded like anger, then falling to a murmur that might have been pleading. Adeline's responses were too quiet to be discerned. The rumors began in mid-May. A merchant from Mobile, delivering an order of imported fabrics and spices to the plantation, mentioned to Martha that he had heard Thomas Beauregard was looking into old property records. The county clerk, a gossip well known throughout the region, had told him that Beauregard had been asking questions about a plantation called Rosewood that had burned down nearly 20 years earlier. The land, once owned by a family named Harper, had been sold off in parcels after the tragedy. According to the clerk, Beauregard had seemed particularly interested in the surviving family members and their whereabouts. This information spread quickly through the Beauregard household, adding to the growing sense that something unusual was unfolding. The atmosphere at the plantation grew increasingly tense as May gave way to June. Thomas continued his strange behavior, often walking the grounds late at night or sitting for hours in the small family cemetery behind the house, where generations of Beauregards were buried. Most troubling was his treatment of Adeline. He had begun taking his evening meals in the small back parlor, insisting that she serve him alone and often keeping her there well after the dishes had been cleared, engaged in hushed conversation that stopped whenever anyone entered the room. June 17th. A heavy thunderstorm swept through Mobile County, the rain so intense that it washed out sections of the road leading to the plantation. Lightning struck a tree near the slave quarters, splitting it down the middle and sending the residents rushing out into the downpour in fear that their cabins might catch fire. In the main house, Thomas Beauregard sat in the library, watching the storm through the windows. Adeline stood nearby, having just brought him a glass of bourbon. As a particularly violent thunderclap shook the house, Thomas spoke without turning from the window. "It was a night like this, wasn't it?" Adeline remained still, her scarred face half illuminated by the flickering lamplight. "Yes," she replied after a pause, "the night of the fire." Thomas nodded slowly, still gazing out at the rain. "And my father was there." It wasn't a question. Adeline's voice, when she answered, held something that might have been pain or might have been anger, along with 6 other men. They came wearing hoods, but I recognized his voice. He was giving the orders. Thomas finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I found his journal," he said, "hidden in a compartment in his desk. He wrote about what happened that night, about what they did to your family, about what they did to you." Adeline's hand moved unconsciously to the scars on her face. The thunder continued to roll across the sky outside, but inside the library, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that had been gathering for 18 years. In the days that followed, Thomas Beauregard made several announcements that shocked the household. First, he informed Isaiah that he would be traveling to Charleston within the month and expected to be gone for several weeks. Second, he instructed that Adeline was to be moved from her room, off the kitchen, to the small guest chamber on the 2nd floor of the main house, a space typically reserved for visiting relatives or business associates. Third, he had his father's personal belongings, which had remained untouched since the elder Beauregard's death, packed away in trunks and moved to the attic. The most puzzling directive came last. He ordered that the portrait of his father, which had hung above the fireplace in the main hall since it was painted in 1825, be taken down and stored with the other items. These changes provoked intense speculation among the household staff and field workers alike. Some suggested that Thomas had lost his mind from the stress of managing the plantation's difficult finances. Others whispered that Adeline had somehow bewitched him, though none could explain how a scarred, quiet woman with no apparent influence could accomplish such a feat. The truth, as it often does, lay buried in the past, in connections and events that had been deliberately obscured by those who wished them forgotten. On the morning of July 3rd, 1841, a visitor arrived at Beauregard Hall. He came on horseback unannounced, his formal attire rumpled from the journey. He introduced himself to Isaiah as James Harwick, attorney from Mobile, and insisted on seeing Thomas immediately on a matter of urgent business. Thomas received him in the study, where the two men remained closeted for over an hour. Their conversation was not recorded, but a servant passing by the door reported hearing raised voices. When Harwick finally emerged, his face was flushed with anger. He departed without taking refreshment, his horse kicking up dust as he galloped down the oak-lined drive. That evening, Thomas called Isaiah and Martha to the study and informed them that he would be leaving for Charleston the following week, as planned, but with an addition to his traveling party. Adeline would be accompanying him not as a servant, but as a free woman. He produced papers already filed with the county documenting her manumission. Furthermore, he explained, upon their return from Charleston, there would be additional changes to the household that would be announced at that time. Neither Isaiah nor Martha dared to ask questions, though both were stunned by the unprecedented nature of these developments. That night, the whispers in the slave quarters took on a new intensity, a mixture of confusion, resentment, and, for some, a cautious hope that they did not fully understand. 2 trunks were packed for the journey to Charleston, one for Thomas and one for Adeline. The house servants, under Isaiah's direction, prepared appropriate clothing for her, altering dresses from the storeroom that had once belonged to Thomas's late mother. The transformation was striking. Dressed in a simple but well-made traveling gown, her hair arranged beneath a bonnet that partially shadowed her scarred features, Adeline appeared almost like a different person. Still, she maintained her habitual silence, speaking only when necessary and keeping her gaze lowered in the presence of others. On the morning of their departure, July 10th, the household staff gathered in the front drive to see them off. Thomas had hired a private coach rather than using the plantation carriage, and he assisted Adeline into it himself rather than leaving the task to the driver. As the coach pulled away, those watching noticed that Thomas did not sit opposite Adeline, as would have been expected, but beside her on the same bench. The implications of this simple action sent a fresh wave of shock through the assembled servants. The journey to Charleston would take approximately 2 weeks, with stops in Montgomery, Atlanta, and Columbia along the way. Thomas had arranged for accommodations at reputable inns, where he registered himself and Adeline as Mr. Beauregard and Miss Harper, the first acknowledgement to others of her family name. While Thomas and Adeline travelled east, events at Beauregard Hall took an unexpected turn. 4 days after their departure, James Harwick returned to the plantation, this time accompanied by the county sheriff and 2 deputies. They presented Isaiah with a document authorizing them to search the premises, particularly the study and Thomas's bedroom. Isaiah, having no authority to refuse, allowed them entry and observed as they methodically went through Thomas's papers, correspondence, and personal effects. They were seeking something specific, though they did not share the nature of their search with the household staff. After several hours, they departed empty-handed and visibly frustrated. 2 days later, a second party arrived, 3 men from New Orleans, whom no one at the plantation recognized. They identified themselves as business associates of the late Mr. Beauregard and insisted they had urgent matters to discuss with his son. When informed that Thomas was away and not expected to return for several weeks, they exchanged concerned glances. One of them asked pointed questions about when he had left and where he might be found. Isaiah, sensing something amiss, provided only vague responses. The men lingered for some time, examining the house and grounds with unconcealed interest before finally departing. Their presence left a sense of foreboding that hung over the plantation like the heavy summer humidity. In Charleston, Thomas and Adeline took lodgings near the harbor, in a modest but respectable establishment, catering primarily to merchants and sea captains. They registered under their own names, an act of either bold confidence or remarkable carelessness, depending on one's perspective. The city was experiencing an unusually hot summer, the air thick with moisture from the Atlantic and heavy with the scents of the market, spices, salt, fish, and the distinctive odor of indigo processing that characterized the commercial district. For 3 days, Thomas made inquiries throughout the city, visiting shipping offices, the courthouse, and several legal establishments. Adeline remained in their lodgings during these excursions, venturing out only in the evenings when Thomas returned. On July 26th, they attended a service at St. Michael's Church, sitting quietly in the back. Their presence did not go unnoticed. Charleston society, like that of most southern cities, was both hierarchical and intimately connected. By the following day, word had spread that a Beauregard from Alabama was in the city, accompanied by a woman whose face bore signs of severe injury, and that they were asking questions about the Harper family, once prominent in shipping but now largely forgotten. The night after the church service, a note was delivered to their lodgings. It contained only an address in the northern part of the city and a time, 3 o'clock the following afternoon. There was no signature. Thomas and Adeline arrived at the specified address precisely at 3. It was a townhouse on a quiet street, its brick facade distinguished by tall windows and a glossy black door with a brass knocker shaped like a ship's wheel. The door was opened by an elderly black man who led them to a parlor at the rear of the house. The room was sparsely furnished, but elegant, with views of a small garden where roses climbed trellises along the walls. They waited for nearly 10 minutes before the door opened again. The woman who entered was perhaps 60, her posture straight, despite her age, her silver hair arranged in a simple but fashionable style. She paused in the doorway, her gaze fixed on Adeline. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the woman moved forward slowly, her hands slightly outstretched. "Adeline," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is it truly you?" Adeline nodded, her own hands rising to meet the older woman's. "Aunt Rebecca," she replied, using her voice fully for perhaps the first time since arriving at Beauregard Hall. The emotion in those 2 words seemed to fill the room. The elderly man who had shown them in closed the door quietly, leaving the 3 alone. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, as 18 years of separation were bridged and painful truths brought into the light. Rebecca Harper had believed her niece dead, one of 9 victims of the Rosewood fire. The news that she had survived, only to be sold into slavery by the very men responsible for the destruction of their family, left the older woman alternating between tears of joy and expressions of profound rage. Rebecca Harper had been in Europe when Rosewood burned, having accompanied her ailing husband to London in search of medical treatment. By the time news of the tragedy reached her and she was able to return to America, the surviving witnesses had been dispersed or silenced, the investigation closed with a finding of accidental fire. Her subsequent efforts to discover the truth had been met with polite but firm obstruction from local authorities. Eventually, she had withdrawn to Charleston, using what remained of the Harper fortune to maintain her modest home and continue a quiet search for answers. The letter Thomas had received from Charleston in May had been her response to his inquiries about the Harper family history, inquiries prompted by the fragments of information he had gleaned from Adeline and his father's hidden journal. Neither Rebecca nor Thomas had revealed their full intentions in their correspondence, each cautious about trusting the other. Now, face to face, with Adeline as the living bridge between them, they spoke with increasing frankness. Thomas explained his discovery of his father's involvement in the events at Rosewood, detailing the journal entries that described not only the deliberate setting of the fire, but the motives behind it. The Harpers had been planning to convert their plantation to paid labor, having developed moral objections to slavery. Moreover, they had evidence of criminal activities involving several prominent families in the region, including the Beauregards, evidence related to the illegal slave trade that had continued despite the federal ban of 1808. The fire at Rosewood had been meant to destroy both the Harper family and their damaging evidence. It had largely succeeded. Adeline, badly burned and believed to be dying, had been taken not to a doctor but to a slave trader with connections to Thomas's father. Her identity obscured, her speech temporarily lost due to smoke inhalation. She had disappeared into the system that her family had been seeking to dismantle. The irony of her eventual purchase by the son of one of the men responsible for her family's destruction was almost too cruel to contemplate. Yet it had created the opportunity for a kind of justice that had seemed impossible for 18 years. During their weeks at Beauregard Hall, Thomas had helped Adeline piece together her fragmented memories, comparing them with his father's journal entries until a complete picture emerged. Now, with Rebecca Harper's assistance, they could take the final steps in their plan. The evidence that Thomas's father and his conspirators had sought to destroy had not been entirely lost. Rebecca had maintained copies of some of the documents, though without the testimony of witnesses, they had been insufficient to pursue legal action. Adeline's survival changed that equation. As a Harper by birth, she could claim her rightful inheritance. As a witness to the events at Rosewood, her testimony could bring charges against those responsible, or at least expose their crimes to public scrutiny. And as the legal owner of Beauregard Hall, for Thomas had secretly transferred the deed to her name before their departure, she had the power to reshape the legacy of both families. On August 15th, 1841, an article appeared in the Charleston Mercury, its headline modest, but its content explosive: "Rosewood Revisited, New Evidence in Plantation Fire." The piece detailed allegations that the fire that had claimed 9 lives 18 years earlier had been deliberately set, naming 7 prominent men from Alabama and Mississippi as conspirators. Among them was the late Richard Beauregard, father of Thomas. Documentation supporting these claims, the article stated, had been submitted to authorities in both Charleston and Mobile. The story might have been dismissed as sensationalism had it not been accompanied by a formal statement from Thomas Beauregard, attesting to the discovery of his father's journal and its damning contents. The same day the article was published, a petition was filed in the Mobile County Courthouse, asserting Adeline Harper's claim to her family's estate and seeking damages from the families of those implicated in its destruction. The legal battle that followed would last nearly 3 years, winding its way through courts in 2 states and generating hundreds of pages of testimony. It never reached a final verdict. In March of 1844, a settlement was reached privately among the parties involved. The terms were not disclosed publicly, though subsequent events provided some indication of their nature. Thomas Beauregard sold his remaining properties in Alabama and relocated to Massachusetts, where he established a modest publishing house specializing in abolitionist literature. Beauregard Hall was converted into a school for formerly enslaved individuals, funded by a trust established in the names of both the Harper and Beauregard families. Adeline Harper's fate is less clearly documented in public records. She disappeared from official accounts after the settlement, though local stories suggest she remained in the Mobile area for some time, overseeing the transition of the plantation. Rebecca Harper's correspondence, preserved in the archives of the Charleston Historical Society, includes occasional references to her niece's well-being, but few specific details about her whereabouts or activities. A letter dated June 1849 mentions Adeline's continued dedication to the cause of justice, despite the physical reminders she carries of injustice. The most concrete evidence of her later life comes from the registry of a Quaker community near Philadelphia, which records the arrival in 1852 of an A. Harper, formerly of Alabama, who established a small medical practice specializing in the treatment of burn injuries. The final documented reference to her appears in an 1863 newspaper account of volunteers treating wounded soldiers after the Battle of Gettysburg, which notes the particular skill of a surgeon with a scarred face who worked tirelessly among the injured of both armies. The Beauregard-Harper case, as it came to be known in legal circles, never achieved the public attention that might have been expected given the prominence of the families involved and the severity of the allegations. This was due in part to the private settlement, but also to the concerted efforts of powerful interests to suppress the story. Newspaper archives from the period show a curious pattern. Initial reports of the case appear in several publications, only to be followed by complete silence, as if an invisible hand had closed a door on further coverage. In 1859, a historian attempting to document the case for a book on landmark legal proceedings in the South reported that key court records had been removed from the mobile courthouse, allegedly during renovations some years earlier. The Charleston Mercury, which had published the initial exposé, experienced a suspicious fire in its archives room in 1847, destroying much of its back catalogue from the relevant period. These attempts to erase the story from public memory were largely successful for more than a century. It was not until 1967 that the case resurfaced in academic circles, when a graduate student at the University of Alabama discovered Thomas Beauregard's personal papers in the university's archives, where they had been donated by a descendant and subsequently misclassified and forgotten. Among these papers was a slim volume bound in faded red leather, a personal journal kept by Thomas during the period immediately following his purchase of Adeline at the mobile slave auction. The entries begin with terse, practical notes about plantation management, but gradually shift to increasingly troubled reflections on his growing suspicion about Adeline's identity and his father's past actions. The final entry, dated July 9, 1841, the day before his departure for Charleston, reads, "Tomorrow we begin a journey from which I cannot imagine returning unchanged. The truth once fully embraced leaves no room for retreat into comfortable ignorance. I go forward now with clear purpose, though the path ahead is shrouded. If there is to be redemption for the name Beauregard, it must be earned through actions, not words. And if there is to be justice for the Harpers, it must begin with one Harper reclaiming her rightful place in the world. What comes after, I cannot say, but at least we move now in the light of truth rather than the shadow of lies." The journal was accompanied by several folded documents, including a copy of the deed transferring ownership of Beauregard Hall to Adeline Harper, and a daguerreotype showing two figures seated side by side in formal attire. The image is somewhat faded, but still clear enough to discern a man with a neatly trimmed beard next to a woman whose face is partially turned away from the camera, her left side obscured by shadow. The graduate student who discovered these materials, Elizabeth Carrington, would later become a professor specializing in antebellum Southern history, with particular focus on cases that challenged the established narratives of the period. Her doctoral dissertation, Silenced Histories, the Beauregard-Harper Case and the Politics of Memory in the Antebellum South, published in 1969, provided the first comprehensive academic treatment of the events surrounding Rosewood Plantation and their aftermath. In her research, Carrington uncovered additional sources that had escaped the earlier efforts at suppression, including correspondence between James Harwick, the mobile attorney who had visited Beauregard Hall in Thomas's absence, and various conspirators concerned about the potential exposure of their involvement. These letters, preserved in the Harwick family papers, reveal a network of influence extending to the highest levels of Alabama and Mississippi society, all mobilized to contain the damage that Adeline Harper's reappearance threatened to inflict on their collective interests. Despite Carrington's groundbreaking work, the Beauregard-Harper case remains relatively obscure in popular historical accounts of the period. The microfilmed copies of her dissertation, along with her research notes and supplementary materials, were stored in the University of Alabama archives until 1985, when they were damaged in a basement flooding incident. Digital restoration efforts in the early 2000s recovered portions of the text, but significant sections remain illegible, creating yet another layer of partial erasure in the long history of the case's suppression. In October 1968, while conducting field research for her dissertation, Elizabeth Carrington visited the former site of Beauregard Hall. The main house had burned during the Civil War, an irony not lost on those familiar with the property's history, but the foundations remained, along with several outbuildings and the small family cemetery. It was in this cemetery that Carrington made her most intriguing discovery. Among the weathered headstones marking generations of Beauregards was a simple marble marker, set slightly apart from the others. The inscription, nearly eroded by time and weather, read, A.H. and T.B. They chose truth over comfort, justice over safety. May their courage be remembered. There was no date, no further identification. Local records provided no information about who might have placed the marker or when. The current owners of the property, a family who had purchased it in the 1930s, knew only that it had always been there, as far as they were concerned. In her field notes, Carrington speculated that the marker might suggest Thomas and Adeline had maintained some connection in their later years, perhaps even returning to the place where their unusual alliance had begun. This theory remains unconfirmed, another piece of the puzzle that may never be fully resolved. The story of Thomas Beauregard and Adeline Harper, pieced together from fragmented records and deliberately obscured historical accounts, remains incomplete. Like many narratives that challenge comfortable myths about the American past, it exists in a liminal space between documented fact and speculative reconstruction. What seems clear is that their lives intersected at a moment when recognition, the profound, unsettling experience of truly seeing another person and being seen in return, created the possibility for a kind of justice that the systems of their time were designed to prevent. The childhood name that Adeline spoke in the Beauregard Library that April afternoon opened a door between two worlds that were meant to remain separate, initiating a chain of revelations that would eventually expose long-buried crimes and offer some measure of restitution, however belated and incomplete. The bonds of family and property, of master and slave, of perpetrator and victim, these seemingly immutable categories of antebellum society proved, in their case, more permeable than anyone could have imagined. Their story suggests that even within the most rigid and unjust systems, the possibility for human recognition and moral awakening remains, however, rare and difficult to achieve. The graduate student's discovery in 1967 prompted a brief revival of interest in the Beauregard-Harper case among historians of the period. Several articles appeared in academic journals between 1969 and 1972, examining different aspects of the story and its implications for understanding resistance and complicity in the antebellum South. However, this scholarly attention faded almost as quickly as it had emerged. By the mid-70s, the case had once again receded into obscurity, mentioned occasionally in specialized works, but largely absent from broader historical narratives. This pattern of revelation followed by renewed forgetting seems to echo the original suppression of the story, raising questions about the persistence of certain silences in American historical memory. What makes some stories difficult to incorporate into our collective understanding of the past? What mechanisms, both deliberate and unconscious, continue to obscure certain truths long after the immediate motivations for concealment have faded? In 1973, a historical marker was proposed for the former site of Rosewood Plantation, acknowledging the arson that destroyed it and the subsequent legal case that briefly exposed the crime. The proposal, submitted to the Alabama Historical Commission, was denied on the grounds of insufficient documentation. The official response cited the lack of surviving court records and the limited contemporary accounts as reasons for hesitation, suggesting that more substantial evidence would be required before such a marker could be authorized. No mention was made of the extensive documentation compiled by Professor Carrington, which had been submitted as part of the application. The proposal was resubmitted twice more in 1981 and 1994, with similar results. To date, no official historical marker commemorates either Rosewood Plantation or the legal battle that briefly brought its destruction to public attention. The resistance to acknowledging the Beauregard Harper case extends beyond the realm of official historical markers. In 1988, a filmmaker from New Orleans attempted to develop a documentary about the case, securing initial funding and beginning research into surviving locations and descendants. 6 months into the project, the funding was unexpectedly withdrawn, with the sponsors citing concerns about the commercial viability of the subject matter. The filmmaker, in a later interview with a regional arts magazine, suggested that pressure from unnamed local interests had played a role in the decision. The project was never completed. Similar patterns have emerged with other attempts to bring the story to wider attention, including a proposed museum exhibition in Mobile in 2002 and a historical novel by a prominent author in 2007, both of which encountered unexpected obstacles and were ultimately abandoned. These repeated patterns of suppression, spanning more than 150 years, suggest that the Beauregard Harper case touches on aspects of American history that remain sensitive even in contemporary contexts. What little we know of Thomas Beauregard's later life comes primarily from business records and occasional mentions in abolitionist publications. His publishing house in Massachusetts, though modest in size, produced several significant anti-slavery works between 1845 and 1858, including first-person accounts from formerly enslaved individuals and legal analyses of the constitutional issues surrounding slavery. He never married and appears to have lived quietly, avoiding public attention despite his involvement with the increasingly prominent abolitionist movement. A brief obituary in the Boston Evening Transcript, dated November 12, 1865, notes his passing at the age of 67, describing him simply as a publisher of reform literature and a generous supporter of causes promoting human liberty. No mention is made of his Southern origins or his involvement in the legal case that had briefly made his name known in certain circles 2 decades earlier. The obituary mentions that he left no immediate family, but directed that his estate be used to establish an educational fund for those recently emancipated from bondage. The executor of his will was listed as Dr. A. Harper of Philadelphia, the sole hint of a continued connection to Adeline. The school, established at Beauregard Hall, operated from 1844 until 1861, when the outbreak of the Civil War forced its closure. During those 17 years, it provided basic education in reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills to over 500 individuals, most of them formerly enslaved. The faculty included both white and black educators, an unusual arrangement for the time and place that drew occasional negative attention from neighboring communities. Records of the school's operations, preserved in the archives of a historically black university in Alabama, include annual reports detailing curriculum, enrollment, and significant events. These reports make occasional reference to visits from the benefactor, Miss Harper, who is described as taking a particular interest in the medical training provided to selected students. The last such visit noted in the records occurred in October 1860, approximately 6 months before the school was forced to close as Alabama seceded from the Union and local tensions made its continued operation untenable. The property was subsequently confiscated by Confederate authorities and converted to a supply depot, which was burned during Wilson's raid in 1865. After the war, the land was sold at auction to help cover county tax shortfalls, eventually passing through several owners before being purchased by a timber company in the early 20th century. The most tantalizing hint of Adeline Harper's later life comes from an unexpected source, the private papers of a Union Army surgeon who served at Gettysburg. Dr. Samuel Winters, in a letter to his wife dated July 7, 1863, described the volunteer medical personnel who had arrived to assist with the overwhelming number of wounded soldiers. Among the physicians who have come to our aid is a most remarkable woman doctor from Philadelphia, her face bearing terrible scars that she makes no attempt to conceal. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the men respond to her with unusual trust. She works primarily among those with severe burns, of which we have many from artillery accidents, and her skill in this area exceeds that of any surgeon I have encountered. When I inquired about her methods, she told me she had developed them over many years, beginning with her own recovery from injuries sustained in a fire some 2 decades ago. She spoke little of herself otherwise, but I gathered she was originally from the South. What struck me most was her equal attention to wounded from both armies. Rebel and Union alike received the same careful treatment at her hands. When I remarked upon this, she said only, "Pain recognizes no uniform, doctor, and neither should healing." This brief description aligns with what we know of Adeline Harper and suggests that she found a way to transform her own trauma into a means of alleviating the suffering of others. The Philadelphia medical practice mentioned in earlier records appears to have specialized in the treatment of burn injuries, likely drawing on techniques Adeline developed during her own recovery. That she would volunteer her skills during the Civil War, treating soldiers from both sides with equal care, speaks to a character that refused to be defined by the bitterness that might have been expected from someone who had endured what she had. There is a profound irony in the possibility that men who fought to preserve the very system that had once enslaved her might have owed their lives to her expertise and compassion. This capacity to transcend personal suffering to serve a larger humanitarian purpose represents yet another layer of complexity in her remarkable story. The final confirmed reference to Adeline Harper appears in an 1871 registry of physicians in Philadelphia, which notes her retirement from active practice at approximately age 60. After this, the historical record falls silent. No death certificate or burial record has been located, leading some researchers to speculate that she may have relocated, possibly even returning to the South during the Reconstruction era. A tantalizing but unverified account from a church registry in Mobile mentions an elderly woman with facial scarring who arrived sometime in the early 1870s and established a small clinic for the formerly enslaved community. The woman, identified only as Dr. A, remained in the area for approximately 5 years before disappearing again. Whether this was indeed Adeline Harper remains uncertain, another piece of the fragmentary record of her life that may never be fully clarified. The mysterious grave marker in the Beauregard family cemetery, with its cryptic inscription to A.H. and T.B., suggests at least a symbolic reunion of these two individuals whose lives became so unexpectedly intertwined. Whether they maintained contact throughout their later years or reunited near the end remains unknown. In the absence of more complete records, the story of Thomas Beauregard and Adeline Harper invites speculation about the nature of their relationship and the motivations that drove their actions. Was Thomas's decision to help Adeline pursue justice for her family driven purely by moral awakening, or were other emotions involved? Did Adeline's willingness to ally herself with the son of one of her family's destroyers represent extraordinary forgiveness, pragmatic strategy, or some complex combination of motivations that defies simple categorization? The fragmentary nature of the historical record leaves room for multiple interpretations, each colored by our own contemporary understandings of human psychology and social dynamics. Perhaps it is this very ambiguity that makes their story so compelling and so challenging to integrate into conventional narratives of the period. They occupied a liminal space between established categories, neither fully conforming to nor completely rejecting the social structures of their time. Their actions suggest the possibility of individual moral agency even within the most rigid and oppressive systems, while the subsequent suppression of their story reminds us how powerfully those systems resist acknowledgement of such possibilities. In 1996, a descendant of Elizabeth Carrington donated her research materials to the Smithsonian Institution, where they were catalogued and preserved as part of a larger collection on antebellum Southern history. Among these materials was a small leather pouch containing 3 items: a piece of charred wood, approximately 4 inches long, wrapped in cotton cloth, a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a young woman, and a folded paper bearing handwritten text in faded ink. The note, dated August 30th, 1841, reads simply, "What was taken by fire cannot be restored, but what rises from ashes may yet bear witness to truth." TB. These artifacts, likely collected by Carrington during her research at the former Beauregard plantation, provide a tangible connection to individuals whose lives have otherwise been known primarily through fragmented documents and contested accounts. The charred wood, presumably from the Rosewood fire, and the locket possibly belonging to Adeline or another Harper family member, serve as physical reminders of the real human lives behind the historical narrative. Lives marked by loss, survival, recognition, and the complex pursuit of justice across seemingly insurmountable social divisions. The story of Thomas Beauregard and Adeline Harper continues to surface occasionally in academic works and specialized historical publications, usually as a footnote or brief example illustrating some broader point about the complexities of antebellum society. It has never achieved the wider recognition accorded to other narratives from the period, whether because of its challenging ambiguities or as a result of the long history of active suppression that has left the evidentiary record so fragmented. Yet even in this partial, incomplete form, their story offers a powerful reminder of the individual human dramas that unfolded within the larger historical structures of American slavery and its aftermath. Behind the statistical accounts of enslaved populations, property transactions, and legal proceedings were real people, people who suffered, survived, recognized one another, made difficult moral choices, and occasionally found ways to challenge a system designed to deny their full humanity. In the end, perhaps the most appropriate memorial to Thomas Beauregard and Adeline Harper is not a historical marker or museum exhibition, but the continued effort to recover and understand stories like theirs, stories that complicate our neat categories and challenge our tendency towards simplified moral accounting of the past. Their lives, as we can reconstruct them from the fragments that survive, remind us that history is always more complex, more ambiguous, and more personally human than our retrospective narratives tend to acknowledge. In a small, scarred room of the grand house that bore his family name, Thomas Beauregard heard a childhood name that no one living should have known, and in that moment of recognition, a chain of events began that would temporarily breach the walls of silence surrounding a buried crime. That the silence eventually reasserted itself, that the crime remained largely unacknowledged, that the story continues to resist full incorporation into our historical consciousness, these facts, too, are part of the legacy of Beauregard Hall and the fire at Rosewood Plantation that connects them. As we conclude this account of a largely forgotten historical episode, it is worth considering the words attributed to Adeline Harper in her capacity as a physician at Gettysburg. Pain recognizes no uniform doctor, and neither should healing. These words, if accurately reported, suggest someone who had transcended the categories imposed by her society and her personal experience to reach toward a more universal humanitarian perspective. Having suffered some of the worst injuries that humans can inflict on one another, both physically and psychologically, she apparently found a way to channel that experience into healing rather than bitterness. Similarly, Thomas Beauregard, upon discovering his inherited complicity in terrible crimes, chose recognition and restitution over the more comfortable path of continued ignorance and denial. Their choices did not change the larger systems in which they lived, but they created a small space of alternative possibility within those systems. A demonstration that even in the most constrained circumstances, individual moral agency remains possible, however difficult and partial its expression. The site where Beauregard Hall once stood is now largely reclaimed by forest, with only the stone foundations and the small family cemetery remaining as visible reminders of its existence. Local residents occasionally report hearing what sounds like a woman's voice singing softly among the trees, particularly on stormy nights when thunder rolls across the Alabama sky. Others dismiss such stories as typical ghost tale embellishments of a historical site. Whatever one makes of such accounts, they represent another layer in the ongoing process through which history becomes memory, and memory becomes mythology. The weathered grave marker with its enigmatic inscription, A.H. And T.B., they chose truth over comfort, justice over safety. May their courage be remembered, continues to puzzle visitors to the site, an enduring reminder of lives that refused to be fully defined by the categories their society had created for them, and of a story that continues to resist both complete telling and complete forgetting. The sound of a childhood name, spoken by someone who should not have known it, echoes across the years, a reminder of connections that persist despite our efforts to sever them, of histories that refuse to remain buried despite our attempts to cover them over, and of recognitions that once experienced cannot be undone. In that moment of recognition between Thomas Beauregard and Adeline Harper, we glimpse the possibility of a different kind of relationship across the profound social divisions of their time. A relationship based not on power and submission, but on mutual acknowledgement of shared humanity and historical truth. That such moments were rare in the context of American slavery makes them no less significant as reminders of paths not taken, possibilities not fully realized, but never entirely extinguished from our historical imagination. The story of Beauregard Hall and Rosewood Plantation, of Thomas and Adeline, remains incomplete, fragmentary, and resistant to neat resolution, much like the larger American story of which it forms a small but revealing part.